Good afternoon, everyone, and I welcome you to the session titled The Disinformation Republic, How Lies Become Government Tools. And the session speakers are Alvaro Beltran Uturia, Digital Democracy Analyst, UNDP, Regional Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean; Andres del Castillo, Chief Technical Advisor, Electoral Support Program, UNDP Bangladesh; Mr. Jonal Abidin Rashid, former Senior Minister for State for Foreign Affairs, Singapore; Mong Min Tho Wang, Accountability and Innovation Manager, Global Network Initiative; Mr. Nurul Kobir, Editor, New Age. And this session will be moderated by Anastasia S. Wiwaba, Project Director, European Partnership for Democracy, Belgium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to welcome you to these conversations about the Disinformation Republic. And I'm honored to be moderating these distinguished panels today because across the continents, the clarity on what we think as a truth is steadily eroding. Rumors becoming facts, institutions not only judged by the performance, but also by perceptions, images becoming realities. So lies that we are seeing is a carefully engineered and algorithm is basically behave like a governance tool. In Asia and in the Bay of Bengal regions, we are watching these transformations unfold in real time. Fact-checking report unprecedented spikes in falsehood. In Bangladesh alone, more than 800 claims appeared in the first 3 months of 2025. So disinformation isn't just about corrupting elections, it's reshaping how people trust, how people participate, and how institutions governs. But the sessions today, we will not discuss or point fingers who's to blame. Our aim is to understand the systems, how the false narrative rewired the democratic behavior, and then we also want to explore and identify how accountability breaks down, and most importantly, we will explore what actually worked. So we are joining with 5 different panels that we will start with the first round of questions regarding what has changed. And maybe we can start with Alvaro. Alvaro, you argue that this information today is rooted in the political economic of incentive and accountabilities. What is the single biggest structural shift in the disinformation landscape in the past decades?
Sure. Thank you, Nas, and thank you to everyone for joining us in this conversation. I think when we talk about disinformation in governance, we could spend hours just deciding when exactly major shifts have happened in our information ecosystems. But I think, again, when it comes to the challenges for this specific governance, I want to highlight 2 specific dynamics that I think are different in the past couple of years from even the scenario 5 or 10 years ago. The first one is the pace of change. When we talk about digital technologies and we talk about adoption and who's using what and in what measure, not just people but also institutions and complex systems are integrating new technologies into their everyday dynamics, I see a huge gap between not just the capacity of the institution to guide the use of technology towards specific dynamics or parameters and boundaries that are rights-based and focused on citizens, but also the need of these institutions to function faster and a pressure to adapt or be basically erased from the scenario. So, for example, there's a recent study by UNESCO in which they interview judiciary agents from 97 countries, and the report highlights that around 44% of judges are using AI in their everyday operations, but only 7% of those judges have received a specific training on how to use AI within the parameters that are rights-based and that are focused on the specific mission of their institutions. So again, we're seeing a scenario in which the pace of technology usually tended to take, at least a couple of years for something to be introduced into the everyday operations of a complex system, and that's no longer the case. People are looking for the solutions, people are trying to approach them in the best way that they can, and they're making a lot of mistakes while they're at it. At the same time, they don't have the capacity to govern in an anticipatory manner. They're trying to govern on a reactive scenario to basically mistakes that are being identified as they go. So that's a first big change in the way that governance is shifting in this specific sector. A second dynamic that I want to highlight is inequality. Inequality not just in access, which is the way that we will typically discuss technology adoption and technology access, but also inequality in the way that these platforms and these systems can be governed, not just in the actors that are involved in that process, but also in the countries that have specific voices over others in that specific context. So this is a shifting dynamic that gets even more complex when we think about the relations and the evolving dynamics between public and private, and of course civil society. And I think that gap keeps on getting more complex. I'm going to leave it there for this starting question.
Thank you, Alvaro. Andres, building on that systematic view, how do you observe electoral disinformation strategies change from originally only rumor-based, now even organized in the digital campaign? How do you see that, the changes?
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, first of all, I want to start my participation today, first of all, to thanking to the organizers, to the Bay of Bengal, for inviting us to be today in this forum. But also, I want to start to mention, we are hearing the world misinformation nowadays is coming on and on in the press, everywhere. However, we should to stop and think about this. Information is nothing new. If we go to the 16th century, to this 18th century, 17th century, when the Europeans start traveling around the world and they were doing the first maps, and they were putting in the maps empty area. They're putting areas. This is unknown area. They were spreading news. The people are willing us to come and to conquer them, to teach them. This was something that it was coming in press in the press of those years, in the old maps. We can see in the old maps all this kind of information was coming. That was the kind of misinformation that was spread during the previous centuries. So it was in the books that were printed there, in the information that it was passed by the church, by the missionaries, telling them, the people want us to go there. But really the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans, they were willing, in Africa, in Asia, we were really wanted to have those people to come, but there was a misinformation campaign that was circulating around the world those years. So this has been evolved along the time, along the years, and what is happening now is that it's reaching to a key areas, political areas, as I'm referring to the past, I'm referring to the recent times. So I have the opportunity to be working in the election field for many years. My first election that I worked in 1999 was the popular consultation for the independence of Timor. There were not internet. Then the information was based on rumors. The rumors were spreading voice to voice. And it's not long time ago, it's quite recently. So the rumors were spread, violence is coming, if you vote this way, if you do that, those kind of tendencies and ecosystems that were already built long time ago and still evolving. Going back to your question, Anna, the area of elections has proved to be one of the most stronger area to be suffer from misinformation. There was one famous case, and I recommend you, all of you who has not seen, the famous elections in Trinidad and Tobago, in which there was an Indian minority living in Tobago, and big Afro-American community. There started spreading the news that the elections is not important among the Afro-Americans. Then this was spreaded, and then the winners there were the minority, the Indian minority in Trinidad. It's a very important case. So elections, it's an area where misinformation can be attacked for all kinds of sides, by the political parties, by the authorities, by other countries, neighboring countries, in the different steps of the process. So it's something that is very vulnerable to be. So I'm stopping here, Anna.
Yes, thank you. And Min, from the platform governance perspective, what has fundamentally changed in how tech companies and governance respond to disinformation?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, and also appreciate the opportunity to be involved here. So I'm from the Global Network Initiative, and we are a multi-stakeholder initiative helping technology companies respond to government interventions that impact freedom of expression and privacy rights. So my answers will be framed very much from that perspective. As the other panelists have kindly pointed out, misinformation, disinformation is actually not new, right? But what is new are three things. The first is the challenge of accessibility, speed, and scale. The second is the challenge of what I would call definitions. And the third is around independence. So talking briefly about the challenges of accessibility, speed, and scale, I'll keep it quick. So what's different today is that the misinformation, disinformation, including in relation to elections, can be spread by anybody that has a very basic technical skills at a speed and a scale that it has not been possible before. Right? So that's one quite significant change. The second is around the change of definitions, right? So I guess talking more broadly about the legal and regulatory context, you have laws in various countries that define actions that companies need to take in relation to fake news, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, but or even national security sometimes, right? But who is actually defining what these vague topics are? What falls within the net of misinformation, right? So, not pointing fingers, but I think there's been a lot in the recent media about these sorts of issues as well, all over the world. The third is around independence, right? So when you have the situation where information can spread quickly, easily, and governments, companies are not doing enough to define what misinformation and disinformation are, and also to act against it. You also need this independent parties to fact check what is the ground truth, as it were, right? And here, we also see around the world, specific governments, even in the Bay of Bengal area, funding fact checkers, right? Or in the case of the EU certifying fact checkers, right? So then that leads to questions around, again, what is truth, right, online? So that clearly highlights the importance of media literacy and critical thinking, not only in the countries around the Bay of Bengal, but also more globally. I'll just share some thoughts very briefly around the kind of trends that we're seeing that impact electoral integrity, both actions taken by governments as well as companies needing to respond to these actions as well. And they are broadly four. I'll keep it at four categories, right? So the first is around the concept of intermediary liability. So sorry if I'm getting a bit technical here, but I'll keep it simple. So who is responsible for what content is on a platform, right? Is it the company? Is it the platform itself? Is it the user? So historically, what's been the case is that there's been something called a safe harbor provision, whereby as long as companies act on information that's on illegal information that's on the platform within a specific time period, then they are not responsible for that platform, for that information, for that content, right? So we're seeing a trend where from that kind of safe harbor provision to automated and mandatory content filtering, right, in many jurisdictions. And that obviously creates concerns around how companies respond to that. The second is, and this is an interesting one, extrajudicial mechanisms for information control, right? So in the old days, yeah, not that old, but nonetheless, in the past, right? You have situations where governments ask for specific pieces of information to be taken down for whatever reason, right? We have moved, broadly speaking, from that kind of system to where governments are actually legislating companies to take action almost automatically, not necessarily through content filtering, but actually getting companies to include within their community guidelines or terms of service content that is automatically deemed or at least flagged to be taken down. So, right, so that's another concern. We also see age verification as a way, mandatory age verification, as a way of controlling what youth see in terms of information, and that obviously has, concerns from a privacy perspective, whether it's opening the door to potential surveillance, and last but not least, and maybe I'll touch on this in the future answer, governments are increasingly seeking to control AI, whether it's through soft law, whether it's through hard law, whether it's through investments in AI and sovereign AI, whether it's through using AI themselves, which actually then impacts how AI is developed. We see very sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated ways of controlling, shall we say, this increasingly sophisticated technology as well. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Min. Mr. Zainul, you have seen governance and diplomacy over decades. And this is also changed because of the disinformation and AI. So in your opinion, how has the state's perceptions about information threats has changed, especially in the era of disinformation?
Thank you, Anna. I'm happy to be here because I find this presence really a learning exercise. I have learned so much. And this is my concern too, in terms of facing the challenges of information, disinformation, the technology that goes with it. How do they actually present to the older generation? I think I must be the oldest on the panel here. I wonder myself why I should be on the panel. I should be sitting there learning from them. But one of the concerns I have is actually this question of intergenerational gap, intergenerational understanding, what this is all about. For my generation, I remember when I first was invited by Colonel Gaddafi of Libya to attend a conference, it was basic interaction, human interaction, no technology, no AI, nothing. But it's that kind of interaction that builds relationships, builds trust, which I think was fundamental to whatever the challenge we face. So as we look at this new challenge of AI, in here we call it AI is like I, right? And when it's I is I, you agree with it. But when you are caught in that transgenerational gap and you find yourself lagging behind, you no longer think of it as AI, importance of AI and I, but it becomes bye-bye. And that's the kind of serious challenge which we have as far as intergenerational consideration is concerned. But I'm glad that there are enough among the young who believes in having this kind of conferences, organizations that believe there's a need for this conference, this kind of conference where we can have better sharing, and this is the value of this conference and the value of having us a better understanding what the challenges are, intergenerational, or even among the young, because their needs may differ. And the needs are changing very, very fast indeed. So if before it was information affect the locals' challenges, but now it's about national security, about social cohesion, and also about diplomacy. AI and related potential that come with AI will have a clear impact on those areas of security, social, national cohesion, and also international relations. This is where foreign ministries, governments can no longer take it as a kind of a slow pace of them getting used to these new needs, but in fact have been totally involved, totally engaged, and totally moving on to make sure that the intergenerational challenges will not remain, but will be enhanced in terms of that better understanding of the needs for today, in fact, today for tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Nurul, as a newspaper editor, how have you seen misinformations and distrust reshape the role of journalism?
Well, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I liked my colleagues' starting point as the history of disinformation and misinformation is not new. Well, for a journalist, misinformation, or anybody for that matter, misinformation can be produced out of innocent mistakes. When you talk about disinformation, this is a deliberately manufactured so-called information which has always some political or social negative purposes. So history has dealt with disinformation it's not new. Say, there are some grand political and philosophical disinformation that we see in the 17th century, for example, 18th century, when David Hume, on his very influential treatise on human nature, claims that Africans, the black people, are inferior to the white people by nature. That's a huge disinformation by a grand philosopher that influenced this history of our civilizations for more than 200 years. Fact remains, the information remains, that Africa is the cradle of human civilization. And the European propaganda was that they are naturally inferior to the whites. Then again, when an influential philosopher like Hegel writes that Africa doesn't have an history because they have been in the mantle of darkness, and darkness cannot have history, and they have to be civilized only by encountering Europe through the enslavement process. That's a huge disinformation of serious inhuman implications. From that, if I come to the present scenario, even in Bangladesh, say a few months ago, Bangladesh witnessed a marvelous, magnificent people uprising against an autocratic government that ruled illegitimately for more than a decade. Now, during these democracy protests, more than 1,000 were killed. Of them, 130 were children. More than 20,000 were injured. Of them, several hundred have just lost their eyesight. And those who were defeated by this magnificent people's uprising fled the country. They are now propagating across the world in the name of so-called information that who killed them, who killed these democracy protesters. Their narrative is the democracy protesters killed their colleagues themselves. And we know by following the reactions to the Facebook postings or other media campaigns, many people across the world, particularly who are acquainted with past history, some of them started believing that must be a conspiracy. that history is never changed. No big changes takes place in any part of the world just by conspiracy. It is the people that changes history remains the fact. But side by side, there are propaganda, and some people swallow them. And that has some serious implications on the development of history as well. It was a conspiracy to change this. Then again, we have an elections ahead. So political parties have started campaigning. In the process of campaigning, I noticed the other day as a journalist that a political party that actively opposed Bangladesh's liberation war 54 years ago and actively participated in one of the worst genocide that took place in this part of the world, they are now claiming, one of their leaders said, we took part in the liberation war, not for this or not for that, for this and for that. You see the twist of history, a twist of information. It's true that they took part in the war, but important is which side they took. So when you say in a vague manner, we also took part in the liberation war. Yes, they took part. So these are the disinformation that seriously affects the society. Or for that matter, when the Western media, even the so-called professional media writes say paints Israeli aggression on Palestine as war between Palestine and Israel. It's not a war. That's a clear case of aggression. So this is a clear case of disinformation at the grand level. Now, every ages has fought against this disinformation, and the generation that we belong to and the generation that coming in, they will also be fighting against these tendencies. I have reason to believe that eventually truth will find its way, but things have really been complicated. People have to spend, or I should say, waste their time to correcting disinformation. And that's a real waste of life, I must say. For us, the professional journalists, I would finish by telling you a small story. A few months ago, a very young group of people, very serious and good boys and girls came to me. They have formed a company called Fact-Checking Company. And they believe that newspapers, professional newspapers, need to have some professional groups of fact-checkers attached to the newspapers. I was a little surprised as a professional journalist. I said, why? Why I should need a group of fact-checkers within the newspaper? Because every reporter is a fact-checker himself or herself. Why should we publish things without checking it? So if the professional journalists themselves are professional fact-checkers, we don't need them. But of course, at the social level, at the political and cultural level, that in the sea of disinformation and misinformation, alternative groups are there, they're working, and I believe the more and more groups will come up for the sake of establishing truth and continue to fight against disinformation. But eventually, information will remain and truth will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. For the next one, Alfaro. So what do you think is what works, what solution works, what ecosystem interventions need to happen that proven to be most effective to strengthen information's integrity?
Me?
Alfaro.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Anas. I think the key word in making this work better is cooperation. I see a lot of investment, I see a lot of research, I see a lot of different actors working in trying to develop new solutions towards not just tackling this information, which I think it's important, but I always feel like it's just reactive and doesn't really addresses the root causes of where we are. So I feel like, again, we have to go back to two of the basics. One, the basics of how to strengthen democracy, and second, the basics of how to strengthen information systems. And again, there's a lot of people investing in these things, developing some really good solutions on these areas, but they don't even know what the other one is doing. I go to many panels, I go to many meetings in which people often discover in the table that they are doing the same kind of thing with the same kind of actors, investing with the same CSOs. And I feel that that is I'm going to say, a weakness in our current model of working on this. So I want to present some examples of where I think this cooperation approach is working. We as UNDP have something called the Global Coalition for Information Integrity. It hosts most of the major players when it comes to electoral assistance on a global level, digital platforms, and most CSOs who are working on the digital rights sector. The initial idea with this was just literally to have a space in which we could just share the ideas and share the actions that we were taking in different countries. And we identified that there was a lot of duplicity. We identified that there was a lot of different things that were overlapping. And just by coordinating our action and making sure that our investment could address the same issue in a scalable manner, we started making higher impacts. We've actually been able to replicate this model, the global model, at a national level as well. So for example, we have now national action coalitions in Bolivia and Chile, Honduras, and each one of these spaces is addressing the same kind of actors at a national level, trying to create, I'm going to say, a more coherent experience and more coherent addressing of these issues. I'm going to leave it there for now, and maybe we can go back to how we're addressing AI afterwards.
Thank you, Alvaro. And go back to Andres, for example, what you have seen in the election world, from your experience, is there any alternative or strategies to prevent these informations from escalating during the elections?
Thank you very much, Anna. Well, in fact, as I mentioned in my previous intervention, elections is one of the areas that can be very vulnerable to misinformation, disinformation. When we talk about elections, we do not only talk about the election day. We started even from the voters' registration, all the voters' registration process, all the preparation of the elections, all they are vulnerable to misinformation, disinformation from those who want to, by any side or other side, to interrupt a process to move forward in a correct way. Going to your question, Anna, what happened is that the electoral management bodies and those institutions that are in charge of organizing the elections, they need to, first of all, start with a very transparent way of behaving. When I'm talking about very transparent way, I remember, and again, put it in a context, I have two different cases that I can compare. I had the opportunity to work in Timor-Leste, and I have the opportunity to work in Mozambique. In Timor-Leste, all the process, even the smallest process to selecting, to start printing the ballot papers, to start testing the indelible ink, to start designing the ballot paper, all are conducted in public and with the presence of the observers, the media, and the party agents. That helps the process to be more transparent and building trust into the public and the voters. Let me go to the other case that I work in that and I saw. In this country, in Mozambique, last year there were elections and they were following a totally different approach. The approach was all closed door. The decisions were taken closed door. The production, the decision for the contested ballots, they were done closed door. And that create a serious mistrusting of the public, mistrusting of the political parties, that something was cooking behind that. So these two examples show us how transparency within the electoral management bodies can help. Then, if there is coming a misinformation campaign, but if you are already having a very transparent and solid process that helps to build strained political and electoral systems. The other way, the more secret the process is done, the less communications are coming out from the authorities, the most vulnerable are, and the more open to being attacked by misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you. And Min,
If I
yes,
may,
you want to add?
If I may add, I think if I get the thrust of your question correctly, I think elections will be a very important test as far as credibility is concerned. How the people look at the government, how do people look at the election. And I think for any country, and you know in Singapore, we've had one government for so long, and there are questions raised about whether in fact there is real democracy. But I think if the media and if information is not used properly, I think it will discredit elections. Elections will lose its effectiveness as a tool of a measure of the kind of democracy you want in a country, the kind of openness you want in terms of political activity. So, but on top of that, I think we will also be a test whether in fact the media, the information industry will be able to attract enough of the young who feels there is a need for balance in terms of information that's required as far as covering elections in particular. So it will be a real test how a country, a government addresses itself to these issues. It will determine the kind of how successful we can allow the information industry, the information media industry, and the information tools to play a role in terms of bringing in that greater cohesiveness and greater sense of oneness in a particular country or community or region.
Good, and that's a good leverage to the next questions to Min. Because what is the most effective governance strategies to regulate AI? Is it possible to regulate AI without basically overreach or doing more a censorship? Is it the regulations? Is it co-regulations? What's your opinion?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And indeed, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all, as it were. Obviously, it needs to be adapted to each country's specific context, and that context will also change from time to time within the same sort of country, right? But what we have seen, though, generally in the sphere of AI regulation, and this is something I said earlier on in my previous panel, is that there are broadly three types, let's say, of AI regulation that we see today, right? The first is, euphemistically called innovation first, I guess, or some might call it no regulation, but innovation first, let's say. The second is more of a safety first approach, more seen very much in countries like the EU with the EU AI Act and so on. And the third, I guess, is some mix of the two, but with a different flavor. It's more of a, let's say, control-based AI, shall we say. Not to use the word authoritarian, but I guess I've used it now. So three broad models, right? And within these three broad models, coming back to your question, we do see a mixture of hard laws, in other words, laws and regulations, soft law, things like guidelines, principles, being used to influence AI development. And indeed, there are other ways that governments are influencing the way AI is regulated per se. Another way is actually through investment in AI. So some of you may have heard the concept of sovereign AI, which is where governments invest in different parts of the AI value chain in order to, for a variety of reasons, partly national security, partly to localize the technology, partly for availability, and partly for access as well, right? Access. And another way, which might not seem so intuitive, is that governments also shape the development of AI through using AI, right? So there has been one good example of that, again, not pointing any fingers, so read between the lines, is there has been a regulation, for example, that imposes ideological requirements for AI that's used in the public sector, right? So that is, interesting, shall we say? That certainly shapes the development of AI. That's, given the fact that the public sector is, a large user, well, I guess, an increasingly large user of AI, and obviously that then shapes the way that these sort of models are developed in the future. And indeed, there is no one-size-fits-all, right, as I mentioned before. So some countries use a mix of, soft laws without having regulations. Some countries use, repurpose existing regulations to fit within the AI space, whereas others enact very specific and dedicated AI laws. Here, looking at the EU as a regional entity, South Korea, Brazil, it's in the works. But what is important, though, I would add, and this is where I'll leave the conversation, is to actually build trust build trust in AI as a technology and build trust in governments in use of AI and regulation of AI. It's important to put the rights of individuals that are impacted by AI first in any regulation, right? So, how does one ensure that rights holders' right to privacy in relation to the way the training data, et cetera, is used? How does one ensure that AI does not discriminate against vulnerable or minority populations? So these sort of concepts are important to embed in any laws and regulations around the world, in our opinion. In other words, having a rights-based approach to AI governance. And I think that is indeed, that will also have a great impact on the misinformation, disinformation, or information integrity broadly that we're talking about today, because that obviously is intrinsically linked to the protection and respect of rights as well.
I think you touched the heart of the matter, the one word which you used, trust.
Yes.
Trust is basic, is key, and is the most important part. But it's easier said than done. To establish, to gain trust is a very complex issue, depending on the history, the culture of the country, the people, and it requires a lot more discussion. But trust is basic and is very critical to understanding what this issue is about.
And I think we are still in a fairly early development of AI. We still don't know what happened in the next weeks or months. So, Nurul, considering that resources and knowledge, our knowledge are very limited, the question is, what should be prioritized? Should we prioritize the capacity, newsroom capacity? Should we prioritize, as you said, about fact-checking? Or should we prioritize policy reforms? What should we prioritize in this current context?
Well, all of these factors are very important that we have already mentioned. But fact-checking remains the first thing, and that's the job of the professional journalist. And of course, for that to happen, if the media has a democratic responsibility to make the political and other actors, powerful actors, to comply with the aspirations of the people, the question of accountability comes. So it's not just providing the readers or audience with information. At the same time, it's important to make some, influencing the public opinion in favor of social and political justice. At the same time, trying to make all the institutions involved that affects the lives of the people in general to make accountable to the people. And of course, newsroom to editorial teams, to the reporters, they have to play their role professionally. That's important.
Okay, thank you.
To have the integrity of the information. The man behind the machine is very important. You have to have the journalists, men and women, who have the intellectual integrity first. And that remains I may sound little old school, but morality is important. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like also to give an opportunity for the floor to ask questions. The gentleman, that's 1, 2, and then the blue one. Yes. Please say your name and to whom the panel is.
Greetings. Myself, Ong Thwagyo Marma Ong. My first question is to Nurul Kabir sir. How spreading misinformation can stop without promulgating an act or policy, because we have experienced that if an act or policy can turn into draconian, for example, in Bangladesh perspective, DSA, which is present government now amended this act. And another question is is an illiteracy a big factor of spreading and misinformation? Anyone can answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's me?
Yes.
Should I respond now or?
Maybe let's just take that one.
My question is to Mr. Andres del Castillo about the disinformation coming from beyond the border. Like we saw after the ouster of the former regime, a variety of rumors started to spread, and the Indian media took it, to a next level, and it still hurts. It continues to spread. So that's one thing. How does the government tackle that in general? And before the election, the election is approaching. What might be the effect or influence on the overall environment on that? And to Mr. Mong, just one question. How do you see the preparedness of the developing countries in terms of AI governance? We see that developed countries already have took their steps, but where does Bangladesh and countries like ours stand at?
Okay, we take one more questions. Yes.
Hello. I have two questions. First one to Mr. Nurul Kabir. There should be mechanisms and several apparatuses to make clear distinction between information and disinformation, as you all have discussed very beautifully. But when it comes to disinformation, as Nurul Kabir mentioned while discussing the theory of human nature of David Hume, disinformation as socio-political basis of any discourse that attempts to dominate the mainstream political perception in society. How do we deal it? Obviously, state and other apparatuses can't just block any discourses. That might be violation of some rights or norms. But in case of socio-political truth, how can we deal with it? What are the possible measures we can adopt? Are there any? Or we just have to accept silently that we live in so-called post-truth or non-truth era? And my second question is to the whole panel. How do you capture the relationship between conspiracy theories and disinformation? And how does this relationship affect any kind of political crisis? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Nurul, maybe you can answer those two questions that address to you specifically.
Thank you. Well, the first question, that whether we need a legislation, of course, to prevent disinformation and misinformation. Any state or any country for that matter, I won't say state, the country should have a piece of legislation. But the problem that we have empirically seen over the last few decades here in Bangladesh, that some of you who are from Dhaka or Bangladeshis, and you know that there had been a law proposed by the previous regime, the Right to Information law, which is directly related to the freedom of speech issue. The preamble of the law said, and they propagated, that they are doing it to protect the right to information of the people and the press. But practically, when we scrutinize the law, that the law was made, in fact, to prevent information, free flow of information. This is how the legislations are made by the state. So when a standard law is important, it is also important to make sure that in the legislation process, that the people the politically conscious sections of the people are aware what kind of a law is being imposed to prevent free flow of information, but in the name of giving the right to information. That's important. So vigilance is very important, intellectual and political vigilance on the legislation process and the content of the legislation itself. On the other hand, the second question that a young friend has asked, that at the socio-political, of course I agree that disinformation, misinformation has to be clearly defined. So these are two different things. As I said, the misinformation can be interpreted as an innocent mistake, but well, for the press, for the mainstream press, if making innocent mistakes becomes the habit, that's a dangerous thing to address. And at the social political level, of course, most disinformation are campaigned by the ruling classes, those who govern, those who had governed or want to govern. This disinformation, state-sponsored, political party-sponsored, and is elite-sponsored. So this is right on the one hand. On the other hand, another section of the elite committed to truth and having some sense of integrity, they also fight it. Of course, so this needs to be fought both at the intellectual level, at the social level, at the political level, at every level. This needs to be fought against, and for that to happen, of course, it's a coalition between them who are seeking truth, who understand the importance of truth for the development of a society and state, democratizing the state. So there should be different kinds of coalition developed so that they can work together. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe Andres and also Mr. Nurul, Andres and also can answer about these informations across borders, the questions to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a very good question. In fact, it's something that we are all seeing in elections, and it's not a secret. We have seen even in the American elections how the Russian hackers came there. We have seen in many, many cases. So that is something that is confirmed, exists. That's not misinformation, it's not a rumor, exists. There are campaigns that are orchestrated with different interests from other countries in order to destabilize the elections of one country, particular country. Particularly regarding that, for example, in UNDP, and then let me point out our colleague here, Álvaro, UNDP has been developed tools, different tools, in order to identify in real time this type of misinformation, disinformation, posts that are coming and are becoming viral in social media. Through these tools, it's a tool that are powered by artificial intelligence, and they can, in real time, they can monitor thousands of posts that are public in social media, in Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc., and can identify later by a team of monitors, can identify which are fake news, which are misinformation, disinformation, etc. Based into that, they can be reaction from the authorities. This is a reactive approach. When something is identified that is coming as a misinformation, disinformation, and can affect, but there's also the preventing way, and the preventing way can also be done through, first of all, campaigns to all the citizens, to all the voters, verifying before sharing. Many people just see the news and share, and share, and share. Verifying, try to have a strong civic and voter education campaign, telling the youth, before you share, verify. That is something that needs to be done. It's in our own responsibility. So there are different ways to do it, to try to fight this information. Not only that one that comes from abroad, but that comes internally.
Thank you. And Min, I think you also have an expertise to answer about the governance of the platforms.
Sure. So I guess the question that was asked was how prepared are developing countries in terms of AI governance, right? And the quick answer to that is it's evolving. So there are different levels of preparedness, and it's understandable because the technology continues to develop at a rapid pace. The impacts of the technology as well, therefore, develop at a rapid pace, and regulation even in developed countries, let alone developing countries, is constantly evolving. So we see a lot of countries in the developing, I guess the global south, to use a more correct term, taking a wait and see kind of approach generally to regulations. We see, for example, in India, for example, where there is consideration for a long-term sort of dedicated AI governance framework, but for the time being, existing laws are being repurposed to cover AI as well. What we also see is that when AI governance does kind of take place within these jurisdictions, there is a general alignment in some way, shape, or form to some combination of the three models that I mentioned earlier. So the three models being sort of an innovation-first model, a safety-first model, and I guess a control-first kind of model, right? So we see a mixture of those approaches being used. Maybe depending on which part of the global south you're in, the control-first approach seems to be relatively more attractive, especially in my part of the world particularly. But what's important fundamentally in the longer term is that, as I mentioned earlier, a rights-based approach is fundamental to any AI regulation, whether it's in the global north or in the global south. That is essentially what allows AI innovation to continue unfettered going forward, because it is only when the rights of rights holders are respected that trust in AI will grow, and therefore the rights-respecting usage of AI will also grow. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to take two more questions.
Thank you. The August gathering here. I am very thrilled, of course, to see the dais and all the covered speakers, especially Dr. Zainul Abidin Rashid, whom I've known for many, many years, my Harvard days with him. My question is to you, actually, and also the panel can also take up. Your first meeting with Colonel Gaddafi with no device, quote, a smart device, I call it, was intriguing to me. The fact that how the world has changed. Last night I was watching Donald Trump with Saudi Prince and also with the New York, the new mayor. I've seen how they orchestrated over the years. And when I look back, one of the story I was reading about Daniel Goleman, he was a Harvard very famous psychologist. He wrote the book Emotional Intelligence. The book he has written was bestseller book in the world. And based on that view, I asked you the question, how much of politics in the Bay of Bengal reaches citizens through devices, platforms, and often disinformation? If this becomes a normal instrument of governance, how do leaders in our region expect to maintain legitimacy with a young generation that lives on open platforms and does its own fact-checking in the real-time basis? And if you had to choose one institutional reform to avoid a permanent breakdown of trust becomes between citizen and the state, what it would be? And it's a horse of dilemma, and I must call it to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the second one is the lady on the back.
Yes, hi. My name is Carolina Chimoy. I'm a journalist for DW. I can't see you, so I'm just moving to the right. It's a very basic question, because I was wondering, one of the root causes why there is disinformation and misinformation, it is probably also because people don't verify, but isn't it also education, like the basic education system? Do you also have projects, do you cooperate with the education sector? And how do you see it? Do you think our system has failed and hasn't invested enough in education systems, and that this is also one of the reasons why we're seeing so much disinformation, misinformation, and people who believe in that and don't question it?
Okay, thank you. So maybe Alvaro, you can answer the last questions.
Sure. There was one lady who is waiting for long.
Okay,
lady.
so
If we still have time, we will do a third round.
cool. So starting with the last question around the intersections between education and vulnerability to disinformation, there's definitely a connection, but I'll say that beyond just that connection, it's not just basic education. It is lifelong education. It is not just about what we teach kids in school. It is also about the way that public officers keep on learning at their jobs how to deal with these issues. It is also about how people across all ages understand their roles, their new and adjusted roles in this new information ecosystem. And I think, across UNDP, but also the broader international cooperation, there's a couple of projects that focus on different parts of this ecosystem and strengthening those capacities so they can deal better with this. Andres was mentioning this idea of Immuito Plus, which is one of our platforms to strengthen data on these issues. Sometimes when we don't have specific data that teaches us or leads us towards what actually is happening, it is much easier to fall into just initial ideas or superficial sentiments on what's happening. But again, shifting the narrative with data and evidence definitely makes a huge difference. So again, Immuito Plus is creating that kind of shift in the system.
You want to add?
Just very briefly about the education system and how it combats misinformation, or how effective it is at combating misinformation, right? So I think education should not be interpreted as, in the traditional sense, right? I mean, we, as GNI, we published very recently approaches for governments, for civil society, and for companies to respond to government interventions to AI in a rights-respecting manner. So have a look at our website for that. But the key point I wanted to make around education particularly is that education can take place on the very platforms where the users are using as well, right? So whether it is sort of, digital literacy training, whether it is, notes to help users to kind of challenge what they're reading, that kind of education as well is important because it happens as and when the users are using the platforms where this misinformation and disinformation is occurring. And indeed, it's relevant for those that have left the education sector already as well, to people like me and the rest of this panel, I guess. So yeah, just wanted to point that out.
Okay. And the last questions to you, Mr.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Mainuddin Munim for that question. I've known him as a businessman. I never expect him to ask a very deep academic intellectual question like that. Your Harvard colors are showing. Well, I think it just points to the fact that in terms of history, whether it's the Gaddafi time, whether it's MBS in terms of leadership, whether Hamdani, I think people are waiting to see what will they come with in terms of ideas that can bring about that better trust. It's not a given. Trust is not a given, it has to be earned. And it will have to be partly because of the personality, the individual's background, standing, and what they come with. Because I think the expectations are different. Before, loyalty plays a very important part. But now, principles. The young will demand principles to see whether, in fact, the ideas, the efforts taken deserve the support. So it's back to the question of whether there's enough transparency with resilience, not only transparency, but it can last the challenges of that transparency, and that can bring about the trust that we want. And the final word is balance. The balance between the two, between the transparency, resilience required, and the trust that has to be built and gained. You need to find that kind balance to bring that about. Thank you.
Thank you. That's
just a minute to take a few words about the last question of the integration of education to fight disinformation. I think there's a very strong point in it. There are other ways that we have discussed, and many of you know much better, particularly the younger ones. But there's an old school thing one thought once again, but I would agree that education and morality is very important in terms of fighting disinformation and the preparing peoples thought process that lying is bad. Lying has something to do with the lack of integrity of a human being. So this is an important concept that the younger generation, through the education system, would be motivated. Well, I mean, it's not only the younger generation. I mean, if you integrate the education system from now, this issue, of course, side by side with other mechanisms, other political actions, other social responsibilities performed by different sections of people, that would have a positive impact in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for such a rich discussions. If I can take one idea from these sessions, is actually disinformation thrives where trust is weak. A lot of people mentions about trust, but trust is slow to build, but also fast to lose. So it's also very important how we can maintain, coordinations across institutions, how we can ensure about the openness. I think Andres and Mintuong mentions about accountability and share responsibility. So I think there's a lot of homework that need to be done by different actors. It's not only one actors, it's a multi-stakeholders to make sure that openness, timeliness, communications, and fairness are being there to make sure there's an information integrity with the rights perspective. Okay, thank you all the panelists, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.